So, look, something I've been struggling with around the topic of anomalous phenomena is finding things that just speak to me and finding things that could be real. And my usual sort of approach is to filter these through the lens of CGI by recreating photos and videos and picking them apart, as well as investigating the stories and context around them. But outside of visual evidence analysis, I've been reaching out in private to a lot of witnesses of anomalous phenomena just to hear them out, to create depictions based on their encounters and find out more. And for the case we're tackling today, there's a lot of additional research behind this thing. And a very well read and prominent UAP researcher reached out to me to make a depiction based on the encounter of Jonathan Weygandt. So let's begin with the story, and then we'll tackle my additional research on his encounter. And this channel is designed to mimic the anomalous while I research and recreate it. In early 1977, Jonathan Weygandt, a lance corporal stationed at Pucallpa, Peru, or somewhere else, was summoned to an urgent call in the depths of the forest. It was around 3 or 4 a.m. when him and his allies were heading towards that direction. There were about 5 or 6 Hummers that they entered into. The drive itself was quite long, and maybe for a few hours, or potentially even 4 or more. But as they approached their target, they eventually would leave their Hummers and enter into the thick forest ahead. It sounded as if the humidity was intense, and the general exploration to get through this point was difficult. Eventually, they would reach closer towards the destination of the crash site, and during that journey, they spotted a strange outline in their surroundings. There was a gash line that was running through the earth. The gash was described as if you took a hot knife and ran it through butter, peeled it away, and this anomalous property was difficult to attribute to any conventional signs in typical crash sites, as when a craft would barrel through, it would not leave such a feature that would be present in here, and the trench itself was about 2 to 3 feet deep. But regardless, him and his team were very easily able to head towards the direction of the crash site because of this obvious sort of arrow that pointed the direction that they could just follow. It was noted that it didn't seem like there was any sort of debris or any other signs that would be typically shown in usual crash sites, because when a craft or plane would barrel through the landscape, it would usually cause so much more damage. Where were the splintered trees and other properties that would usually exhibit itself? It was strange because all there really was a scorch mark that was trenched into the earth, and it's unknown how far back this line even went, or how far it would keep going if they kept following it. But moving on, Weygandt and his 2 allies, being Sergeant Allens and Sergeant Atkins, were 10 to 20 meters ahead of the rest of the team. The entire unit composed about 8 to 10 people, but essentially Weygandt was part of the crew that would be in the front. Eventually, they would reach a hill. The time limit from the car to this location is currently not specified. But however, from the time that they got to this location, the sun was just about rising, and it was about 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning. The gash kept going up and over the hill into something that seemed like a divot in the earth. It could have been a cliff, a ravine, or something of the sort, but regardless, it was potentially made of granite, or another rock with a similar visual appearance. Ahead of them was a strange sight. It was nothing like they've seen before in terms of conventional aircraft. It glowed in such a strange way. Its material properties were bizarre, and Weygandt himself was quite versed in terms of different sort of aircraft, and it was like nothing that he could attribute or identify as anything he was familiar with. While his trio were the first to witness what was ahead of them, the rest also were able to witness it in time, and I can only imagine what they might have been thinking when they saw this. And the journey to get here was not an easy one, and it was very long itself, and now, what were they even going to do here? This thing was bored into the side of a cliff. It was a deep drop to get down there as well, but eventually a plan was spun into place. Weygandt's trio would split off from the main group and make their way down and investigate the scene. The drop would have been deep, and there was also the possibility and later discussion around the topic that during this time, it hypothetically could have been possible that they were being observed. But essentially, future context around the situation didn't make much sense without this possibility, but regardless, they started making their way down this cliff. If you were looking directly at the object, and then to the left of the gash line would have been a traversable enough pathway that would allow them to climb down to get to a lower level to investigate the scene. The general descriptions available for this traversable section is quite limited, but it sounds as if they had to climb down certain sections of it to get to that ground level. But sometime afterwards getting down there, they would be viewing this thing from a different angle. And I suspect as they got closer towards this object, it must have been an unnerving sight for them. But regardless, they move closer towards the scene, and a strange and anomalous hum noise that has been attributed to other cases rung throughout the air, and it almost sounded like an unplugged amp, but it almost felt like it was chemical in property. Or at least this is the closest word that he could attribute to the characteristics or tinge to the noise. But for the craft itself, it was seemingly embedded into the rock, partially, but still embedded, and it was jutting out at a 45-degree angle, and out of it was pouring a strange and anomalous liquid. From the craft itself, this liquid almost seemed green and purple in coloration, but its exact materiality was difficult to describe. That coloration seemed to shift and change at every glance that he got of it, and while it seemed transparent, at other times it almost seemed as if it was reflective or silver-like in materiality. And while the entirety of the cliff's height is currently unknown, that a ballpark estimation between the distance between the craft and the ground was about 150 to 300 feet, or 45 to 90 meters. And the distance from the craft to the hill was 200 feet, or 90 meters. And lastly, the craft itself was quite large, it was about 65 feet long, or 20 meters, and the actual height of it was about 32 feet high, or 10 meters. And the craft's surface seems to be compromised somehow, maybe struck by a hawk missile, but somehow still intact, when it otherwise should have been completely disintegrated. And when descriptions of the craft were gone into, it was talked about in a way that it almost felt alive, or like how you would treat something like a body extension or a limb. And it was also speculated that if you shone a light on this thing, it likely wouldn't even show. And additionally, it didn't even seem to cast a shadow. And all these properties must have been confusing as they defied logic or didn't seem to show conventional materiality in any sort of sense. But yet here it was, this bizarre sight in front of them. And getting even closer now, they could see an additional detail that the surface of this craft seemed to have strange notches and bumps on it as well. And as they were looking up at this thing, an eerie discovery was made. From one of the hatches, there seemed to be some sort of hand. It was four-fingered and jutting out of the hatch. Its scale was too large and too immense to be anything belonging to the human frame. This craft itself was giant, so the thing inside of this thing must have been giant itself also. And the interior of the hatch was one of the only sections that were casting a shadow, alongside with the sort of gill-like structures that appeared on the side of the craft. And those forms seemed to step down in ellipsoid shapes, all while a red light seemed to circulate the trim of this object. A warning to headphone users: if you want to lower your volume, I'm going to be trying to resimulate and accurately depict the auditory noises and the properties of this craft, but it may be too loud, so feel free to lower your volume unless you want to hear it in its full potential. The circulating of that red light and the sound would soon dissipate as they got closer to the craft. And accidentally, Weygandt had gotten that same strange liquid on his car keys, which would soon darken and get eaten away. And the area where it touched his skin would have a permanent feature, one where hair would refuse to grow, as well as other potential anomalous side effects. Disclaimer: the following scene is moving from physical space to an exploration of psychological aspects of the mind, making it inherently difficult to accurately depict or do justice, so assume it is heavily interpretive, stylized, and not literal. And then gradually, a sensation had come over him, and it was unlike anything he had experienced. It wasn't some sort of easily described physical discomfort. It was the feeling of something like a deep mental intrusion, the presence of an other in his mind, of something reaching into his consciousness, like a faint radio signal, channeling or boring in. It was almost painful and impossible to ignore, but it felt as if there was an intelligence on the other side, attempting to communicate. But through that initial mental static, it turned into something more comprehensible in his mind. And then he saw them, projected into his thoughts. Beings. And they were tall, taller than any human could be, reaching 10 feet or 3 meters, and while it was difficult to figure out the exact number of them before him, he felt as if there could be 3 or more, and they had a presence that was deeply beautiful, and an overwhelming sense of love was radiating from them. It was like emotions you'd feel like something like family, or maybe something more. But these entities, although alien in nature, they were so profoundly human or beyond human in their projected emotions. They stood before him, and their faces and figures reminded him of tall greys that he heard in so many accounts, and he commented that their face in particular, it almost looked like the cover of the Communion, although thinner somehow. They also bore an otherworldly elegance in their presence, like an ethereal or angelic presence that filled him with an earth-shattering awe. And this mental projection was so vivid, commenting that it was like watching a movie unfolding in front of his eyes. The emotions he felt were extremely overwhelming. He was gripped by their feelings of terror and their feelings of peace, as well as the understanding that they meant him no harm at all. And during this time, he was completely transfixed and lost in thought. And in the time that would follow, Weygandt would reflect on this encounter, an experience that had left an unshakable mark on him. Through witnessing and experiencing an almost incomprehensible beauty, he often wondered about what he had experienced and stated after some time, if he had the chance, he would leave with them. And as Weygandt was lost in thought, his allies present at the time were in a panic. Their fears of beckoning for him to get it together, not penetrating his mental fog that gripped his mind, only until they had literally jolted him and taken him out of that transfixion did he begin to regain his consciousness in the presence of this craft and the beings contacting him. And soon in time, that fear of his allies would turn into frustration and anger in towards him, because during it he was completely gone, like a sudden interruption that felt so out of place. And now, after all that, they decided that it would be best to turn away from the object and began to make their way towards the direction that they had come from. And as they were making their way towards that area to retrace their steps and path and climbing back up everything to return safely to report back to their unit what was even occurring here, they reached the top of the gorge and were met with an unusual sight. Figures were approaching, people wearing a variety of things such as black armor with no insignias, raincoats, and a variety of different hazmat suits. And around 30 of these high-tech hazmat personnel were observed heading towards the direction of the ravine. And their appearance was diverse, yet they all moved with a purpose, but it was cold, methodical, and with calculated efficiency. And Weygandt and his allies and the rest of the team were rounded up, and in that moment, Weygandt resisted and he struck a member of the black team, which resulted in him being subdued. He was detained and
pushed to the ground, where that same strange liquid already on his clothing spread further along his body as he was made an example of in front of the others. And these people were ruthless. They bound him by his hands and feet, and they strapped him to a stretcher. How had these people even gotten here? They must have been observed for a while, or somehow gotten to the scene. But as these people moved past him on with their mission, he was taken into a Chinook that came in afterwards. And inside, he noticed one of the gunners wore a strange skull mask that he described as almost looking demonic. And during the flight, Weygandt received death threats where he was forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. He was later taken to an undisclosed facility where he was interrogated for an extended period of time, and while he was not physically harmed during the interrogation, the experience was intense and traumatic. But eventually he would be released. However, unfortunately, the chaotic situations he faced were not over. But what he saw that day, the craft, the beings, the liquid, and the personnel, as well as all that had to follow afterwards, it remained with him permanently. Alright, we're out of it now. If you're new here or unfamiliar with the processes afterwards when I recap these encounters, I start looking at things from an analytical, investigative, and speculative sense. This will dive into territories that may be a bit weird or uncomfortable, but essentially we're dealing with a topic that we don't know anything definitive, so even if there's a fraction of a chance that I can learn a little bit more in terms of potential information, I'm interested in exploring its hypotheticals. And it's been a little while since I've uploaded as well, so expect this to be a little jank or unpolished, but basically what we'll be looking into is the materiality, the morphology, the liquid, the NHI involved, as well as the black team, as well as hypotheticals like where this thing could be even located. And I also made some 3D prints of these things if you want to support development around these things. But essentially they would be supporting me in terms of research, recreation, and witness interviewing that I do. Potential funding is something I'm still trying to figure out, and I'll dedicate a section to that later on. But yeah, if you're interested, feel free to check it out. Also, just moving on from that, this case will be compared to previous cases that I've tackled, as well as witness interviews that I've done. And through that process, I will be exploring hypotheticals, and it's going to be a very speculative discussion. And honestly, I still feel kind of weird about how to walk that fine line of exploring and discussing these things, because as I'm trying to analyze the threshold of design or functionality of everything, I have to explore it still, but I still need to figure out the best sort of method for that. Well, the channel's name is Cargo Cultish, so I am trying to research and recreate these things, so this is very much the space to explore and navigate that. So let's begin.
And I just want to focus on the liquid that was pouring out of Weygandt's craft now. So that was described once again as purple green at times, and then also other times almost transparent or reflective. And so all of those things are very much polarizing colorations in terms of complementary colors, meaning opposite ends of the color spectrum, and then factors being reflective and then entirely transparent. So there does seem to be some sort of polarized, at least, color and material appearance property system going on. And how you call some of the effects going on would be like the mother of pearl effect. But in terms of it actually being there, I'm just going to say maybe for that. But also, I guess there's a lot of nuance within this specific material that I'm not sure if I can entirely confidently attribute it to something like the mother of pearl effect, because it might be more anomalous in property as well as have a lot more additional attributes to it in material property. Okay, I want to have a big sort of brain dump in everything about the liquid that came out of this craft as well. So as it was exiting the vehicle, all of this liquid has to come from somewhere essentially, right? And it could be coming from the shell, just exclusively from the, I guess, exterior of the craft. But I think a lot of it is coming from internally from the craft, because he talked about it from leaking out of the hatch and potentially, I guess, also the compromised hawk damage missile areas. But so if that's all coming out of it, then this interior of the craft would potentially be entirely full in a non-compromised state, entirely full of this liquid. So with all the liquid inside this craft, how are NHR going to just be in there? Where apparently Weygandt, through secondhand discussions, where apparently he stated off camera, he believes that it's possible, but that these things could have been aquatic. Like they could breathe this liquid, which I guess could also mean that they would be swimming around in it. Because once again, where did all the liquid come from? And if you're kind of moving around in this thing, you could kind of treat it in a way, if it's super like viscous like, then it could kind of be a shock absorber. In terms of if you're hitting stuff or whatever, if the craft's rotating, maybe you can still kind of keep an independent position when your liquid's moving around, or you can kind of move around it like an anti-gravity kind of thing, or just because you're just kind of moving your way through a liquid, floating up and down and keeping a fixed position in different areas. And as he was observing the surface detail in this thing, he talked about the surface detail being like notched and bumped. And I kind of think about that in a way where it could be just the default surface is notched and bumped. The really interesting thing he said when he looked at it is like the whole thing in general, he just said it looked like art. And that was pretty striking to me. As well as something that could have been made in a shop or handmade, which is bizarre. But one of many reasons why I do this is because I've been interested if there's any sort of cultural values, beliefs, or appreciation of beauty through artistic values that could be extractable from these cases, or if any of them hold any more weight than meets the eye. I don't know if it's all functionality based once again, or if it's both functionality based, but maybe also embedded within that is some sort of appreciation for art and beauty. But as I look into these things, they feel like they have such interesting design that feel ratio based, symmetrical, and I just can't help but feel like there is an appreciation for beauty somewhere within this, unless it's all functional. But these beings in the scenarios where they feel so emotive and human-like or beyond in their emotive range, I do wonder what sort of cultural-based systems that they would have, like art. But continuing off the point that I feel like it could be in a compromised state, and obviously, but the compromised state is making it into notch and bumps potentially. Because if you think about something like a balloon, when you compromise it in substances like liquid nitrogen or so and so, like I'm not saying that this is a liquid nitrogen, whatever, whatever, but basically when you look at the form that happens there, it kind of has like notches and bumps and it deflates in a way that it compromises in a weird sort of notchy and bumpy way. So I feel like the surface could have been smoothed, and then this liquid that's pouring out of it is acting as sort of a structural liquid in a way as well. So I think I agree with Weygandt in this potential hypothetical scenario of them potentially being aquatic. So if they're submerged within this liquid, and that means they could potentially move around in this very heavily viscous liquid that's pouring out in a way that's almost like the properties and speed of something that would be like tree sap, I assume. Um, and it could be like syrup or something like that as well. But you got to remember, this thing was leaking for hours. And like, if it's got like a heavy, like a little bit more heavy viscosity, this thing would just be absolutely pouring out of it like mad. So it's going to be very, very slowly pouring out. And while it was described as viscous and syrup-like, I don't know the exact sort of thickness and if it was still able to maintain sort of a flow in that form as if it was like semi-solidified but slow moving, like waterfall, or if it was pouring a lot faster, then it wasn't able to create such a sort of form in the air. So there's probably some sort of viscous scale that you can rank this viscosity of something. Funny word, but um, basically, I think it would have been slow. Anyway, so I want to talk about my theory on another aspect of this liquid, and I believe that I don't know exactly when he had his psychic contact, but there's a reoccurring factor that I've been thinking about and have been investigating in other cases, where there has been a bit of a tangent, I guess, but there's been examples of potential use of EEG headset technology. And basically, that's something that you put on your head so you can monitor activity within a brain and sometimes to control things. But there are developing technologies that essentially explore this concept. And this will make more sense as I discuss this on why I'm even mentioning this. But we've heard about things in the past where encounters have EEG like headsets or headbands that go around NHI. And that sometimes can just be metal bands, it can be veils and the like. And while you sometimes usually expect things to just be like mind to craft transfer with no sort of medium or equipment that would assist you, maybe that is the case every now and then, or maybe those things have an additional sort of purpose. But essentially, there are known equipment based stuff that you put on your head for a potential additional function. And surprisingly, one that I haven't heard talked about before is that in the Roswell crash, there was recovered headset technology from the craft that was reportedly talked about by quite a few researchers at the time. And that was pretty striking to me. And it was even described in a way that it had conductors, it was flexible, like a plastic, and that just sounds like an EEG headset. And basically, why I bring this up is because I feel like if there is an existing reports of something that is like mind-based equipment, then I can kind of see a hypothetical scenario where this liquid might be something related to like a consciousness link or something like that. So if these beings are submerged within this liquid, then hypothetically, I could see them using it in a way that it's kind of acting like an EEG headset that lets them do some sort of additional mental action within the presence and context of this craft. Okay, and in terms of Weygandt, when he touched the liquid, I wonder if after he touched the liquid, he started going like shortly afterwards into a psychic contact scenario. And if that is the case, then I do wonder if that liquid was sort of that propagator or medium, and it's like he connected to it by touching it. And basically how I kind of think about it is like, uh, how would like it's like just the new brain popping up in that network, and then they probably want to contact whatever's going on there as well. So maybe that was one of the establishing factors in terms of like why he even was psychically contacted potentially. And it might just be him individually that was psychically contacted, since I haven't heard of any reports of his other members in his team experiencing anything like that. And when it was occurring, it seemed like a painful sort of feeling. And I feel like if you have two entirely different brains in um, different ecosystems that brain structures develop over, God, a stupid amount of time essentially of evolution or whatever the hell they got to get their brains. So basically, you have two different brains that are both very much alien to each other, even biologically, and probably just how you even process information, I presume, at least. And even just a human to human scenario, this might be the first time some people are hearing this, but basically, no one's taught how to think since birth. And what I mean by that is that not everyone has an internal monologue. Everyone processes information differently. Everyone has a variety of different degrees and abilities in being able to mentally visualize things. Some people, as a default in their thinking process, are always thinking visually, and you can talk to people and ask them, and it's so interesting every single time that like, hey dude, how do you process information? And they're like, I only process things in single word things in my head with larger concepts added onto them. Huh, what are you talking about? And then you ask someone else and it's like, I have no internal monologue, or I have full internal monologue but no ability to eventually visualize things or something like that. And specifically in that scenario, it can be really shocking to hear that like, wait, the Simpsons like thinking bubble with the visualization, that's not just an artistic depiction, you're actually living that as if it felt real in your mind. What do you mean? And like, not to give you anxiety or make you feel bad about having any sort of form of how you process information, because even if you search like CEOs and search like in your field or anything like that also, as well as how do they process information, you'll find out that like they're completely unhindered by the fact that they process things in a certain way, and everyone's like still completely coherent in those sort of positions, and is still extremely talented and skilled. So we just process this information all like individually and differently. And while it's difficult to change from your original process, I have found as soon as you become aware of it, you can start experimenting and wiggling around different avenues of processing thought. For example, no internal monologue to some internal monologue, or complete aphantasia or mental blindness to be able to see things within your mind. Not talking about drugs here, I'm just talking about brain do brain things. So there's a huge variety of degrees that people sort of process information, but everyone can still reach levels of baseline coherency. So there's that whole concept, but imagine trying to translate that into human to human contact, let alone anything greater. But honestly, I recommend you just ask anyone or even write in the comments how you think and process information, and you'll be surprised by how everyone responds. And now taking all the complexities of just human to human contact, going back to NHI to human contact, where they might have entirely different sort of concepts and avenues and ways of processing information hypothetically, you can imagine that if you're trying to translate concepts over and making it coherent enough, I wouldn't be surprised if that process is headache inducing or painful. And also, I wouldn't be surprised if you went like, what the fuck is going through my mind, or transfixed by that. And that hasn't even yet to take into account like the differences in emotive and intellectual ranges between us and an NHI. Because the way that he describes it in interviews, it almost feels like it's almost difficult to fathom. But seemingly so overwhelmingly positive as well as genuine in their fear. Um, and of course, with all these cases, as I look into them, with NHI involved, sometimes it almost does feel a bit weird in terms of their emotions. Like sometimes it feels genuine and casual and makes sense in terms of the scenario. And I think this is one of those circumstances where I totally give them the benefit of the doubt. But also, I just want to briefly touch upon that sometimes those sort of psychic communications, if I take the word for the experiences, then it feels like a semi manipulative potentially, where it's like instantly the person there is calm after saying calm down or be calm or do not fear me, where default emotions are hijacked or deviated in some way. Basically, I don't really know what the motives of the NHI involved in those situations might be. And of course, there could be a difference in moral systems between theirs and humans, and it might be completely fine in their eyes, and which could be the case for those situations. I don't really know the grand scheme of everything. And I'm not even talking about one, I'm just more talking about it in a very broad sort of sense. But specifically for the Weygandt case, I think it's entirely different in context because he just came across them. And those scenarios are other scenarios are just completely different. But yeah, they seem genuinely fearful and potentially, at least, just food for thought for those other situations. Okay, now let's go back into the topic of the craft. He specifically talked about how he was surprised to see that this thing was likely hit by a Hawk missile, but the damage that it received was anomalous. Because usually when you get hit by a Hawk missile, it sort of shotguns and damages the craft like just a regular plane or something like that. It leaves it in a state of disintegration and disrepair. But the craft of this NHI origin seems to be it's compromised, but structurally it seems to be quite sound still. And I don't know the exact sort of like makeup of this entire thing. Like, does it have like a transparent exterior, like something like a hard glass, then a liquid, and then a black interior lining that's solid? Or is the entire exterior just this liquid and then it kind of looks different when there's no lighting inside or something like that, making it just look dark? But what I was thinking about was the only thing that comes to mind really in terms of material properties that I'm aware of that can receive hard hitting like stuff like that, and that is kind of viscous as well, is like non-Newtonian fluids. When you punch them or you really deliver like a force into them, they become extremely solid, and then they can also shatter and stuff like that as well when hit with a hard enough force. If you can make like a modification to how that material would act, then maybe something could exist like this, but I'm not so sure. But like just to play out the lists of the potential hypothetical properties of this liquid, you've got something that was described as potentially alive. So this thing could be an organism, or at least felt like it could be, and it could have psychic link properties. And then it's acidic, and it has mother of pearl effects, or at least that's the closest word that we can attribute to it. And it can also change from transparent to reflective. And then it can potentially have non-Newtonian fluid properties that it can take a beating in the way that it's taken. And while the whole craft potentially might be made out of a liquid, it still allows for a structured form. And it's flowing in a way that's almost like a syrup or a sap. And the coloration to it is polarized and complementary. And anytime you try and get a glance of this thing, it seems to change in appearance somehow while it flows and shifts. And it seemingly didn't cast a shadow, and if you shone a light on it, hypothetically, it wouldn't appear. And while potentially being the main material that allows it to be anti-gravitic, it may also be the cause of the propagating chemical thrum sound throughout the air. And you may be able to swim through it and float through it. It maybe even provides a glimpse into their preferred habitat conditions. And it's potentially dangerous enough that you might need a hazmat, and if you get it on yourself, you might have negative long-term anomalous side effects. Like, what even is this slurry of a liquid? And to repeat again, it could be conscious or living. Taking a nice strange bath in the anomalous slime liquid. I mean, I guess the NHI are fine, but not recommended for humans. And then, of course, what is the deal with the gills and the light? And also the trim. So let's go through them. So the gills, like, is that propulsion based? Is that for oxygenation or some other random thing? I have no idea, but the only thing on the craft that doesn't that has a shadow. And I don't know if it's like similar to Herrera's case where it's like the Vanta Black kind of vent system that was going on, but it seems to like step down in ellipsoid shapes as well, which is pretty weird. But in terms of what those things could have been on Herrera's case, they could have been like planar arrays or something like that that you can see on some other craft that have been seen. So maybe something like that. It could be like a planar array as well. But it almost feels like reminiscent of gills. But those same sort of gill structures potentially appeared on another craft in Camp Polk. Um, and taking how it's represented in the depiction, it seems to change orientation. No idea what to make of that, but the sort of red light that went around as well. What is the purpose of a red light, and then why does it shut down? Like, what's even causing that apparent shutdown? Is it a consciousness delink, and that's the noise that it makes when that happens? Or is it the engine shutting down? Is it a mix of both? And why is there a red light going around this thing? And why does that have to stop? And why is it even red? Is that a functional thing? Or what? Because I have been wondering for a while, it's like, why do UAP in general have lights? Is it like aesthetic? Is it functional? Is it like how we use light systems on planes? Maybe it's just a visual byproduct of, I guess, something anti-gravitic. But they come in all different colors and formations and whatever. But I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that part out. That's for sure. And then jumping into the seam lines, because there seems to be a consistent talk about seam lines on egg-shaped UAP of similar nature. And is that some sort of like um, area that a field can leave out of something like that? Like, I have no idea. But just all these properties in this craft is just making me scratch my head. So I want to talk about a previous case that I've talked about, which was the Vietnam Black Triangle, where a thing was shot down and then sort of barreled through the forest, and then some apparent whistleblower went to investigate that scene and take a photo of it. Now, the materiality of that object feels very weirdly similar in description to Weygandt's material of his craft, and I'm just going to go through the list and So it almost feels like an inverse or altered, modified version of that same sort of liquid. And it was a liquid craft once again, where
It was black, first of all. Black like you wouldn't believe. It looked like solid state motor oil, if that makes any kind of sense. It was shiny, like if you could freeze liquid mercury without showing any physical signs of it being frozen. It could look like polished glass, and yet the material it was made out of seemed to move at times, like a lightly disturbed body of water. That motion seemed to produce random iridescence across the surface.
okay, so let's pick this apart. That's a description of the craft that I looked into before. And well, firstly, it almost seems like a liquid that can move, and then it's black instead. And I kind of, if you can attribute to like a generalization of these things, I would think of this version like a black rainbow, and then Weygandt's materiality like a white rainbow, and you kind of get like these two different properties going on. And if you think about that's a very generalized sense, by the way. But if you think about the fact that it said if you could freeze liquid mercury, it might look like it. So that's a reflective surface that's a liquid based. And then it could also appear transparent. That's another descriptor that came up in Weygandt's case. But here's the important part. In all previous interviews that I've seen so far with Weygandt, he hasn't talked about it being transparent or reflective outside of an upcoming interview that's going to be released shortly. So in all the ones in the past, it hasn't been evident, at least in the media that we have accessible to still now, because we don't have the full access to some of these things. We still have edited down versions of those interviews, though it doesn't seem like I've been able to find anything where he has directly spoken those words on a public interview. However, there are second-hand accounts by Greer and other people familiar with this case that do talk about reflectivity. However, they don't talk about transparency as a whole other attribute, at least in terms of what I've been able to dig up so far. So I feel like with this Vietnam Black Triangle thing, this story came around like a year ago, but it has an additional descriptor as well as a lot of material description lineups. But continuing off the point of the additional material descriptor being the fact that it was transparent, isn't circulating knowledge, seemingly. Yeah, so I wonder if this other case might hold some more weight potentially, because how did it get such a weird lineup with these descriptions? But once again, it's like an inverse version of it, where it's like described in a way that almost feels like it has that same mother of pearl effect or oil-like, but instead black. And then it's also reflective and transparent, and moving like a liquid, but still can maintain a solid form. But one big difference I can notice is that Weygandt's craft was described as having no shadow, whereas this one you can see a shadow that I analyzed. But I guess since this could hypothetically be a modified version of it, then its properties might be slightly different. Because like water and glass, when you have light going through them, or other sort of transparent liquids, they don't cast as much as a shadow, but as soon as you make a liquid into something oil-based and thicker, then it would cast a shadow. So something could be occurring within the liquid's properties that could have these effects. But in terms of the whole scenario around the Black Triangle UAP, while there is a lot of interesting lineups as well, like the rough interrogation and being forced to sign NDAs and other stuff, I'm still working out the legitimacy of it in general. So that's a step-by-step process. But there's definitely enough there that has left me very interested. And if this case holds more weight than meets the eye, then unfortunately, as of currently, I'm the only person who has actually looked into this case, as well as discussed it publicly, and also looked at it through the lens of analysis. And while I'm still inconclusive of what it could be, it's really a shame because this thing was posted online and then archived, and the post was removed like very shortly afterwards, and it's been almost a year now, but I don't really know. but it's gonna be rattling in my mind, that's for sure. So I do encourage to look into my previous investigation on that encounter, as well as the description where I post additional research that I do on it, since I made a lot of additional developments after that video, and it's kind of similar in theme to this one as well. But obviously after this video, since I still want to pick it all apart, and I think it's worth doing, but if you want to go have a run ahead, then, I can't stop you. So next I want to talk about the hatches on this UAP. And while he was viewing this thing, he was able to see this hatch on the left, a divot that indicated there could be one on the top, and then on this right side, I don't know if he ever got the ability to view it, but seemingly not. But it's a it's hypothetical that these forms will replicate to the other side. And I do wonder if when he was viewing it off the cliff, that any of his other teammates or him might have seen an additional form sticking out, that could indicate that the other hatch was open or another hatch existed there. Now, currently, this is in sort of crash mode, which is the configuration that I believe was possible that the hatches were open in essentially. And for the number of hatches in this thing, if there's three hatches, I was wondering if it could potentially be pointing towards that there were three NHI in there only. But it's possible there could have been more. But if there's three in there, then they essentially, if they're landed or however they wanted to exit the vehicle, they could all exit the vehicle unobstructedly. Essentially, they could just leave all their hatches essentially one by one. And if that's the case, that might make sense. And I'm switching over to a gray model now, just so I can discuss a specific detail. And it's something that we take for granted, but with a hinge-based system, you basically need an access point, an axis that you could rotate on. But if you have two circles over each other, you don't really have that sort of um, point where you can rotate things on unless it's slightly indented into an object. Unless something like this is all you need for a hinge-based system in their craft. But with hinge-based systems, you usually have a sort of square-based things that kind of move and not clip. They don't clip into each other essentially when they're opening and closing. But with two circles and a hatch opening like this, there is potential clipping issues. So I wonder, and that's not just a thing based on this model, that's just a thing based on how forms would move around, at least with hinge-based systems that we're familiar with. So I do wonder if the material, uh, if it's like a bendable kind of thing, because it is made out of the liquid, essentially, or if it's okay for things to clip into each other because it's squishy, essentially, or it's made of that liquid, and you can essentially have this slight clipping of a form that can have a hinge-based system that slowly intersects sections or just pushes the liquid out of the way, essentially. Um, so that was the thought I was having in terms of things that I think that we take for granted. So maybe we'll get more specific details about the exact shape and opening mechanism or rotation, because that can determine how these things open a little more. Because comparatively to the Camp Polk one, the form of that hatch was in a completely different location, and a different shape as well, and based on the depictions that we have based around it. So yeah, it would be nice to know the actual accurate form and rotation angles of this thing. Yeah. Like hypothetically, if it was rolled to the side a bit or whatever, maybe that might make more sense. And you gotta also remember that it was very far away, so and a long time ago, so you're not gonna exactly see super specific details in areas that you can't even see in general. But in terms of like angle that it was rotated at and specific shapes and whatever, it lets you maybe get closer to an answer. Okay, I want to talk about the NHI now, because there's something that caught me off guard, and it was the size of these guys. Initially, I thought they were short grays, and I designed the craft to have a sort of, um, with my current understanding, I didn't realize that the interior of the carafe was also full of this liquid, and that's more like recent developments that came out and through emerging interviews. And so with this liquid inside of it. But originally, I had a floor in the middle. It's just sort of like a speculative additional form. But now that I know that there could be a liquid inside it, I removed it, and it made sense with them being taller as well. Because originally I was struggling to think of like, how is this arm hanging off of this thing? That maybe means there's a platform in the center, but now that they're giant, then they're just potentially just hovering in this liquid as well, or laying across the sort of curvature of the craft. I mean, it could make sense when they're shorter and they're just floating in the liquid, but it's just an additional thought I had that I was thinking about when I was developing the depiction around this encounter. And with these beings potentially being up to 3 meters tall now, then it feels like more likely that the whole entire interior of the craft was hollow. Now, continuing off of the just discussion about the NHI, um, interestingly, there were a lot more emotive compared to other NHI, because NHI in other encounters that are tall greys, a lot of the sort of recent narrative that's been going around is the fact that they feel robotic in nature. And I think that might just be they could be biological drones or whatever, but maybe it could be a similar scenario where we create robots in our own sort of image, and they are kind of doing that themselves, creating robots in their own sort of image. And that's why you have things that like they barely even react or move really robotically, have only like base functions, like covering their eyes when there's too much light or just stumbling around or um, so and so. But these ones seem to be genuinely emotive and fearing for their own lives. So that feels like a break in that narrative that is important. And I also want to talk about like that these things could be aquatic in nature, as it's briefly mentioned that it's a bit of a theory that he might have. Does that mean that they could have gills? Where would they be? On their neck, on the sides of the face? There have been other examples of NHI that could have those gill structures on their body through different regions as well. And I bring this up because they have things that appear to be like gills on the sides of the craft, but they might not even have gills or anything like that of the sort at all. And then do they have ear holes or anything like that as well? And what's its skin texture if it's aquatic? Is it like a slimy or something like that? Or how you could see in like other aquatic creatures, they have like a very specific skin type, I guess. And also the head shapes of these beings, as well as the shape description of this craft, were weirdly similar. Same goes with their heads in comparison with the hatches. So I don't really know if it's either an artistic choice, coincidental, or functional based thing, but regardless, an odd and interesting detail. An event that came to mind was that as I've been interviewing witnesses of UAP, someone actually saw something that lined up somewhat similarly in morphology and coloration to all these other sightings as well of egg-shaped UAP, where they saw a blue-green UAP by the ocean, moving in and out of the water essentially. And this thing was in their vision for quite a while, a few minutes actually. And then as they tried to get closer to it, unfortunately, they weren't able to. It kind of just darted off. But they were talking about their sort of experience in a coffee shop. And as they were describing it, someone in there at the time kind of freaked out because they had seen the exact same blue-green UAP about 30 years prior. Unfortunately, since this person was quite old, they might have likely passed away by now. But there's still sort of contacts that may occur in terms of relatives that can be communicated to. But this UAP that this guy saw, it hung around the beach for a while, and he made it down to witness the craft hovering over the sand, and he heard like a humming noise coming from this thing as well, and then it darted off. So those are quite similar properties, but as he went to that area, on the sand was a perfect circle of glass, about 10 inches thick in the sand. And he apparently took photos of this thing, which might still exist, but like this, the first witness that I was chatting to, he hasn't been back to that place in a while. And he could potentially still get access to that stuff, and I'll keep you updated if there's more information about that. But he took photos of this thing, and he also took a large rock, and he broke that chunk of glass, that perfect circle of glass, and he took it home. And as he took those pieces of glass home, he gave one of those shards to the witness that I was chatting with. And the piece of glass itself is quite interesting if all of this is related to each other. And looking into the glass, and how I've really been thinking about it is that it looks superheated and like bubbles of air like are insanely trapped in this thing. And if you look at things like slag glass and other types of glass that can appear, it the reason that there's so much bubble in it and bubbles are in it is because there's nowhere for the air to escape essentially, and it just gets like trapped in there. and but the interesting thing about this specific glass is the crazy amount of bubbles in this thing. Like it got super heated like instantly, and all the air is just kind of trapped in there. But the amount of superfine detail and quantity of bubbles within this glass is difficult to find any sort of comparison with anything online, in terms of a similar looking amount of bubbles, essentially. And there could be other reasons why this sort of glass is like this, but in terms of the information that I could find, that is potentially one of the reasons. And I think in one of the photos, you can see sort of that flat plane of glass that would have been part of that flat circle uncracked. But if I think about that in relation to Weygandt's encounter, and this thing just sort of like slicing through the earth like a hot knife through butter, um, this might be sort of a similar sort of property occurring as well, where it's just sort of superheating the whole area. And a reason that I was thinking about why that could be occurring, maybe it's like if this thing is ripping through the earth, for one, if you constantly just burn your and melt your way through an obstacle, liquidize it, I guess, you're never really hitting a solid object, so that means you can negate crash damage further by making a majority of the solids ahead of you into liquids. Or at least if you're sliding across something, if you hit a sort of steep object like a cliff, that's a different story. So going back to negating crash damage, and also if you're landing a thing like this as well on uneven surface, like sand or like a bumpy ground, if you just flatten it all out, like you've heard about, oh, you've seen like scorch marks on like this story, many stories about scorch marks and stuff like that in grassland or whatever. But basically, you burn and flatten it completely, that you're on an even surface. So that could be one of the reasons where you can flatten surfaces, but you can also level it out or melt your way through the earth if you're crashing, essentially, up until at least an object is too thick. And maybe that's a property that is represented in this glass, which is freaking cool, if that's the case. So I do wonder if different crash sites and landing sites have a similar property that's occurring of a materiality or function that lets them melt their surroundings. Okay, so let's talk about the design of the craft. Weygandt himself wasn't able to identify the embedded section into the rock because all it's embedded, and he wasn't sure whether if it was sharpened on the end like a teardrop shape or if it was rounded like an egg shape. And I'm leaning towards the latter of it being more egg shaped because as I've looked into other cases, there's some major sort of similarities that I'm finding between these designs, where first, majorly, would be that a lot of these egg-shaped UAP are described with an exterior trim ring that goes outside of the craft. And this trim is either thin, thick, indented inwards into the craft or extruded outwards. And in terms of its materiality, you can see every now and then in these cases that it talks about these eggs glowing. And then for this glow, there seems to be a bit of a potential consistency going on where it's glowing green purple, green blue, and green teal. And then also it can just glow white at times. And there's also other cases where it entirely does not glow. It could just be black, it could just be white or a different coloration. But still, I saw a sort of pattern going on, at least with similar colors to the Weygandt encounter. And then also on top of this, so the reporting of glowing white eggs, so if you zoom out of something that is iridescently glowing, it can just appear like a white object. So potentially glowing white objects do have maybe like a coloration to it, but yeah, they could be completely white as well. And then in the daytime, I'm wondering if they could just show up as just regular sort of white, or if the lighting conditions are a bit unique, maybe they can show up as white from far away as well. But still, the material could just be white itself, with no other alteration. Something that comes to mind, for example, could be like the Zermora case. Yeah, and then a bit of a tangent, but Skywatcher themselves have talked about seeing one egg encounter during their um, sightings that they've been doing, and that was described as white. So I do wonder if that's the same sort of property going on, that it could actually be iridescent. And importantly, I think it's worth discussing that a lot of egg-shaped UAP kind of get a comedic approach to them. It's funny, I guess, but also we should just discuss why eggs are the shape that they are. And outside of it literally just being a word that we attribute to something which is a sphere-shaped object that is just a bit more top-heavy, um, the reason that it is beneficial in nature for something to be egg-shaped is that it finds resting points a lot more easier. And the sort of smoothed out surface reduces contact points when it's rolling around. So when an egg falls out of a nest, it finds a resting point more easily and reduces damage. So something I've been theorizing is that with the potential reason behind some of these craft that are egg-shaped could be something like crash mitigation. I guess they could be taking, where because it's the shape that it is when it's crashing, maybe it doesn't cause as much havoc compared to something like a rigid object. Um, so yeah, and then also in comparison to Jake Barber's eggs, and proportionally um, in relation to Weygandt's egg, if you compare the two, and I've created a representation in a previous video that sort of explored Jake Barber's egg and created a form representation that was accurate to the frames within that video, because it's rotating in space, and then you can create a 3D representation that's accurate to that form. And then I've created a form representation of Weygandt's one with his drawing. However, it's still worth keeping in mind that one is a depiction and another one is based on video evidence. But it still might hold some weight. And if you compare the two, there is a hugely different sort of proportionality behind the two's sort of curvature. And there's a big negative space between the two. So I do wonder if there might be some sort of underlying properties behind the way that they design these curvatures in terms of a system and methods that they may use, because there's many different ways that nature itself represents eggs. Sometimes they're tall, sometimes they're short, and they all have different properties when they're tumbling around, as well as how they react with different systems, circumstances, and environments. And I speak about this just in a generalized sense. Since like the designs or like makeup of all these things within nature have billions of years to refine themselves, we can essentially learn from them, or even go into things like biomimicry to improve our own technology or understanding of the world. And then in the past, for things like mathematics and science, we've been analyzing things like patterns and proportionality in things within nature to derive things like formulas and methods. And our current understanding is based upon our own observable sort of ecosystems and analysis of the world around us. And interestingly, despite our understanding of all of this, we still don't have a fully agreed upon methodology and equation to sort of calculate the curvatures of eggs. There have been a lot of emerging attempts to do exactly this, and I'm not sure if everyone would still fully agree upon with them in terms of one method that we all can agree is the right way to go around this. But there's still many different methods that is used to try this. And in relation to NHI technology and things that are in the morphology of things like eggs, or proportionality and potential design between all these UAP in general, with this sort of complexity that occurs with our own sort of formula around our own sort of design structures, maybe there's something that we can sort of tap into if we keep creating a accurate form representation library of 3D models that represent egg-shaped formed craft that are caught on video or accurate depictions based on their forms. Ideally video, but this is all just to say that hypothetically there could be mathematical designs and principles behind all these objects. And this is definitely not only exclusively towards egg-shaped UAP, it's every single morphology within UAP in general. But I have been getting the feeling that a lot of UAP designs are very geometric and mathematical in form, so, no harm in sussing it out. And on screen right now, just a compilation of a lot of my visual evidence analysis, as well as when I've been chatting to witnesses and creating depictions of what they've seen and chatting with them and trying to create a form representation. And through just sort of like cataloging and recreating, I can sort of see a potential representation of, proportional design hypothetically being represented in this. There's a lot of additional context with all of these cases individually, but for now, I'll just leave them as the images and then dive into those individual cases is sometime in the future, essentially. Some of them I already have, though, and feel free to check those out or even just ask me. And, I'll go into this more in detail later on, but if you've seen something that you believe is genuinely anomalous and then you don't really get to process it because of a community or because of the people around you, because people just get thrown under the bus and it's pretty unfortunate. And of course, there could be explainable situations and outs in terms of what you've seen. But what about the people who have seen something genuinely anomalous in terms of its materiality or its movement or its form or just the experience in general leaves them completely bewildered without an explanation? Well, that's not fun because you don't really get to process that or really have an sort of back and forth sort of conversation where you can explore that open-mindedly and look at it in detail and remember things in a more sort of constructive and beneficial way. And I believe through the process of creating visual depictions, it lets you have that out as well as a visual representation that you can show to other people as well or use as a piece to look at this thing and just process in terms of what that even was. If that's the case, then feel free to reach out via email or Discord or anything. And I'm happy to just chat with people to see if I can compare and categorize and, look into these things. Because, well, for one, I'm deeply interested, and two, it definitely deserves it. And three, I believe it could be very beneficial for you to discuss it and maybe process it even a little bit, as well as the world just to understand it a little more. But jumping back to the topic of mathematical and proportional design that potentially could be showing in these designs in general. And I basically just do this because I find it interestingly explorative. And we kind of did the same thing with things within nature, where we're sort of analyzing patterns and forms and proportionality of things to build our own solar system. So maybe it should be touched upon. So it's pretty much a replication of that. This is more just a play on the idea that if people got actual hold of these crafts, then they would be able to do something like this. Since I'm just doing it based on visual evidence and depictions, it's a bit of a different story with less confidence. Accuracy will only be as good as the clarity of the sources, but it's still helpful to explore this. Some of these are definitely outside of my capabilities, but it's more just an interesting direction to discuss and look at. But I can still create those libraries and then maybe something can be learned from it. But that could potentially, if was to entertain that hypothetical and we play that in relation to other things that we've done in the past, then I guess you can look at things that they could be using, like their own mathematical systems, or if they use a ratio-based design system, or why they choose to use specific methodologies of calculation in the crafts that they design. Can we find any proportions or designs in nature that they may have used? Because maybe there's some sort of benefit to it, like in our own systems that we use. And through this process of replication, maybe you can sort of tap into their systems that they use. I have no idea as of currently if there's some sort of system being used that could be repeatedly seen throughout these X-shaped UAP, as well as all UAP in general. It was very much a thought experiment that I thought might be worth entertaining. Since if we look at some of our own systems from an external viewpoint, you can see things like repeat patterns within architecture, within engineering, and so on. And basically we do an inverse scenario that would be essentially about them instead. But don't get me wrong, I definitely have some theories what's going on and assume that every single UAP recreation that I make is a further exploration or testing of those principles within reason. And then since I'm exploring all these options anyway, I might as well discuss if it's possible that we could identify any sort of underlying human formulas and design principles or anything that we understand that we've sort of taken inspiration from in nature and so on, or just completely externally discovered by ourselves.
And keep in mind, like everything's discussed so far, this is entirely hypothetical and very much speculative, just in the hopes that maybe there's a chance that anything could be learnt at all. And if you're curious where my mind's at as I explore this topic, it's all done in a way where I'm essentially an eternal fence sitter until I can find something that undeniably, defiantly, and clearly proves that certain aspects of the phenomenon are real without a shadow of a doubt. And basically, I never accept anything as fact until proven otherwise, but I still think it's worth exploring these possibilities. Even at the risk of looking a fool or misunderstanding things or not really knowing what's going on, but I try and line these things up for the hell of it. Maybe they might be valuable someday or maybe not, but might as well try and might still find it interesting. An attempt is maybe better than no attempt. And then in terms of just very much hypothetical potential lineups in terms of proportionality within some of these structures, for example, Jake Barber's egg, the closest I could really find was like moss egg geometry, but that's just like, I really don't know. Or like potential lineups with um, a form where if you take a sphere and then you extend it across the edge from that point, and that elongation measurement could be something like hypothetically half of pi, but I think it's just a bit of a guess, really, and more just really a shot in the dark of something that I might have noticed that might hold some weight. I have really no idea. And you can look back at that video if you want. It's pretty jank, but whatever. And then since I'm on that topic of that video anyway, I'll just state that the model itself was only based around Jake Barber's egg video, and then at some time afterwards, some images came out from an entirely unrelated case. So I was like, well, these things just came out, and I have the recreation of Jake Barber stuff, so I might as well analyze them, even though it's just very much early days of that stuff coming out. And then in terms of that other scenario, I'm just gonna say it's weird. Uh, and there might be suspicious details going on in it, but I think it's a bit too inconclusive to say anything definitively. In terms of the situation and video that came out when Jake Barber went public, I still find it a bit more interesting comparatively, that's for sure. Anyway, moving on from Jake stuff. And then in terms of like potential lineups that I saw with Weygandt's one, I was looking around and I found a paper that lined up in terms of proportionality of one of the images in it, and it was basically discussing different formulas and methods to calculate eggs. And the two methods used was Cassini's method and Descartes' method. And I don't exactly know which one was used specifically for the image that I found that was a lineup within the paper, but one of those I think maybe could line up because it lined up pretty well with the drawing, unless it was using its own method. But basically, the image itself within that paper, its tapering and proportionality lined up very well with Weygandt's drawing, enough so that I decided to base my model on its proportionality and design. But once again, I have no idea. I'm just seeing if there's any sort of links to human-based mathematical, I guess, curvatures and calculations and pre-existing proportionality that might be represented here. Too inconclusive to really determine anything, though. At least at the current stage that I can do it at, based on the evidence they have. And while, yes, I am viewing these things through the lens of human-based methodologies, it's not necessarily that it's human-based technology or anything like that. It's more just like the best thing that we got. Because if you saw something like alien architecture or structures or design, you'd wonder why they even chose those forms to begin with. What's the deal? What's the benefit? Is it all just aesthetic or is it semi-functional? Are there underlying principles? Can they be identified? I don't know. Maybe. But basically, there's always a better way to go around this, and the ways to do that is having good photo or good video. Or, a good memory to guide good depictions, but ideally you would want visual evidence for this sort of analysis of potential design principles occurring. And a good example of this in terms of accurate and research depictions would be the S4 team, to my knowledge, in terms of what they've done for the experience that they've been creating in the documentary. As well as the late great I look up to greatly in terms of Okay, now I want to talk about the two main leading areas that is believed that this crash could have occurred. And it was between Iquitos and Pucallpa. And there was also a third option where like another sort of unknown base could have been here, and then they crossed over to the border of Bolivia. But there's not enough information to go to support that claim. So far,
it's just between Pucallpa and Iquitos. And in sort of recent investigation data, that it was talked about from a 4-hour drive radius from Iquitos were points of interest. And as I've looked into this area, and it doesn't really seem like it lines up with the correct descriptions of the landscape and terrain that could have been occurring. So what I want to talk about is the specifics of the ravine that this crash occurred, and it was described as being um, about 200 feet across, which is about 60 meters, and then from the ground into the ravine, looking upwards at the craft, it was about 150 feet to 300 feet, and um, that translates to 45 meters and 90 meters. So that sort of range that they're looking up and seeing this craft. So that means that, and there's also that hill as well. So if you look at this sort of region in around Iquitos, that means that you need to find an area that um, I guess is a bit more common for that sort of terrain to be possible. But as I've looked into this whole entire area and then all of the sort of terrain that you can look into where it shows height maps and everything, this whole entire area is just extremely flat, like jungle. And it doesn't really feel like it lines up. Like even in the radius that was predicted, and even further in this radius, it's like it's really, really flat. So there needs to be a big divot down for this thing to make sense. But I couldn't really find an area that really align so much with that sort of description. So that's pushing back to, at least for me, it's pushing back towards being more likely in Pulkoper instead. Because if you go around and look in this region, it's a lot more mountainous in this area comparatively, where um, this is about a 4-hour drive away. And just a quick comparison, I can actually zoom into Iquitos a bit more, just so you can get a bit of an idea that if you look all around and from this direction, you really can't make out any sort of change in the terrain, really. And even if you drive out quite a bit, it's all just sort of flat terrain. And going to Pucallpa, if I can find my way there. Pucallpa, there you are. So going to Pucallpa now, you can, as you zoom in here, you can see there's a lot more options around you for something to crash. So let's discuss the sort of two main hotspots that I feel like is possible for this to have occurred. So if Pucallpa is the place where this sort of encounter, where they originated, they drove towards for plus hours or whatever to get to this location. Um, First up, it is also described that he doesn't know if the area was still affected by drug like wars going on. And first up, I want to say is that this whole area here, um, it's has a history of being in that sort of war zone area of drug drug cartels and whatever fighting. And so there's a conflict in history, and um, this area, as I was looking around it, it does feel like it could line up with a terrain where, well, if it's just moving like a UAP just crashing through this, it's eventually going to hit like a snag and then go down one of um go down one of these things essentially and then into like a ravine or whatever. And unfortunately, some of this satellite data is not the best quality, and that just kind of happens by default when you go to less traveled places around the world. Um, but and you can also like jump through timelines and stuff like that to sort of negate that, which is good. But um, the sort of general areas where I feel like it's possible where this could have occurred is so there's a sort of line that I put between um, Tingo Maria and up to um, I think around Saint Lucia, and then everything to the right of that. I think this whole range here is plausible. Anything further starts getting too far out of a drive to get to the location, but anything in this range starts getting into the points of interest. And there's still road access and stuff like that that lets you go around, but it's I don't I the issue is that I don't know how long the trip was from getting out of the car to going to the forest and then following that gas line, and then how long did that take to get from the gas line to the hill that they saw the craft. So like what's that length of time that you break from the road essentially? I don't know how long they're walking for. So this is the main sort of gorge, and I mean I spent uh, a stupid amount of time just being like looking around for any sort of like like just sort of entertaining ideas or whatever. And like this is an event that happened like um long time ago now. So almost 30 years actually. However, there still could be still consistent details like the surrounding landscape, existing roads, and the fact that he talked about that there was a granite surface that this craft crashed into, which makes me believe that you would be able to find throughout this whole entire endless green patches of exposed granite, which could point to higher likelihood of that to be a location for this event to have occurred. And if you can kind of match all this up, then maybe you can funnel down. But I guess as I was looking around, I was just sort of entertaining the ideas of like, okay, how close from the, like a main road does that happen, and then when does it turn off, and then calculating the time distance between all of this sort of like traveling, and there's only like a couple, there's like not in a crazy amount of roads here as well, so that does help like whittle down the possibilities. So that is my sort of best guess currently. And then there's guess number two is instead of going westwards, if you go back into Pucallpa, zoom, 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 there's another mountain range out southwards. So heading into the southwards mountains now, I'll just sort of give a brief explanation of some of the layouts as I looked around here. So there's sort of three ways I believe you can kind of get into a region accessible within 4 hours of this area. And you can go straight down the center of this mountain range and then head into this area. And there's still like sort of sparse roads that kind of go around. And unfortunately, a lot of these roads are not really easy to find in terms of records that show the whole layouts of them. So if they go into the forest, it's a bit more harder to find. But that's one route. And then there's towns on the right that you can still access that potentially they could be getting close to, or just towns around it that have like road access into potentially more mountainous areas. And then on the right side, it's still a bit it's a bit sparser and more difficult to get to these areas, but you can still like follow roads along the river line that can lead you towards these areas. But and then those towns also head into they have roads that head into these regions. So with all that in mind, I want to give a sort of my personal pass or guess onto how this sort of compares into a description that might line up. So you can already see that there's it seems to be quite a bit of like flat plains that can occur in this area as just a sort of general statement on things you can find around here. And there does seem to be like hard divots every now and then as well. So potentially it could line up a lot more. And just comparatively, these two regions, so deeper mountains up here, it's a lot harder to get to here within the time limit. And also, there does seem to be a lot less exposed granite surface comparatively to the other mountain on the west side range. But also here, there's a lot less exposed granite, but closer to the, how would you call it, the entry or earlier sections of the mountain, closer to Pucallpa. Um, there is, it's still kind of sparse, but there are areas of interest that feel like could line up with just a landscape that might have exposed granite surfaces that don't really show up as well on satellite view. And you got to remember, like, these surfaces might be red weirdly with satellite view, so it might be too sheer or something like that, or sort of like um, rip down existing terrain information since it's getting like a single viewpoint and might not show like exposed granite surfaces. So that's a bit unfortunate, but just the case that we have to deal with. But um, there are still decent. Every now and then you can find like exposed bits of something. Um, that I don't know if it's not it doesn't really look granite like really, but and it could just be like cut down or burn paths or whatever. But there does seem to be patching going on here, but I don't really know if it really lines up with the descriptions of a granite cliff that we want to really find. So I feel comparatively to this area, there are patches going on, but in comparison to what I'm seeing around here, that you can find like a lot more exposed patching of things that look a bit more like granite in these areas. Um, as I was just zooming around, it definitely felt like I was getting a lot more luck in terms of being able to come across surfaces that could be like that. But you also have to find something that has like a divot and what is it, 150 to 300 feet at least to the craft, and then that 200 feet um, across from the width of the area. But yeah, anyway, this westward round mountain range still is a winner comparatively. Um, and then going over to just to have a look at the initial area in Iquitos, and that is right here. So with Iquitos, while I was looking around, the terrain maps that were at least a bit more interesting around this area in terms of potential lineup, they were mostly heading a bit north eastwards. And me and a Spanish-speaking guy were looking through some terrain maps and assessing this whole area, and we both kind of came to the conclusion that it just didn't really feel like it lined up just because of how flat a lot of these or all of these areas are consistently, and they don't even really change much in height from like um 20 meters or 60 feet. So it's very minimal in terms of changes in this area. And statistically, I'm not so sure if even if a hidden ravine somewhere within all of this jungle that doesn't show up on terrain, like terrain scanning, um, like if a UAP was to hit that one sort of terrain, sorry, that one sort of ravine and then go into it, but also like um, it has to be a deep one, like quite deep, like previously mentioned. Um, and then if I like compare that to how I look at Pucallpa and the mountain ranges around here, yeah, it just feels a lot more like where basically if you're hitting an area with a ravine or a cliff, then you're more likely to have that occur in a mountainous or hilly area. But as I was looking around Iquitos, just a sort of generalization of these areas, so drawing a bubble around these areas, um, like even southwards, it's super flat again as well, unfortunately. Um, no changes in terrain really in terms of height or at least barely. And then I was hoping for it to be a bit different when I went up northwards, because there's like mountain ranges up here. But like even if you try and head towards that direction, it's still like um very, very flat as well. And then heading backwards towards like the I guess the coast kind of uh towards Pucallpa, same sort of issue happens as well. It's just all very much flat terrain. And it's worth stating that with Iquitos, there could have been additional information that I'm not privy to that led to a deeper investigation into this area. Um, but if we jump into the third option, um, we have no idea when a hypothetical third base could be. There's no documentation of it, but potentially they crossed over into the borders of Bolivia and past the border, and then they were in a potential area with ravines that could be more possible. And I'll tell you that some of the terrain around just this area, at least, and there's a lot of exposed rock surfaces with rainforests next to them. So it's possible, but based on the documentation we have available, and there could be a new emerging ones in the future, or just additional information and descriptors around, um, I guess, the area that this crash could occur and all the lead up towards it, and in between just a detailed description, then things could potentially point towards other areas more likely. But based on the information that we have and the documentation that we have, it still feels like Pucallpa is the main candidate in terms of hypothetical crash zones. That could have been the area where this whole encounter took place. And in terms of an actual base, just check my notes based around all the interviews and come to your own conclusions because it's not personally a thing that I really want to touch upon. And then in terms of still existing signs of damage and remnants of that, well, I think the anomalous liquid, even if it was damaging the environment, it's been so long now that it might have just healed over. But maybe you can still potentially find remnants of that in the area. I have no idea. But more importantly, UAP has bored into a cliff face. And it may be quite deep also as well. So you would have to cement that over or somehow make it look um, or you maybe you'll just leave it. I have no idea. But basically, that could still be an indicator or something like that, hypothetically. And then, even if you were able to locate the area of this crash site, it's worth repeating that in an interview with Weygandt, where Michael Herrera was also there, and this sort of same discussion occurred in terms of the crash site's location, it was repeated that essentially that the area is very much likely surveillanced, dangerous, and no one should go there. And now to switch topics, since this is a rare circumstance where we're potentially seeing the inner workings of a retrieval team. How do you even get this thing out of here? And you also have to clean up like the scene potentially as well. So the thing that came to mind was Jake Barber's supposed egg UAP retrieval video that was taken, where I guess you could cradle or sling this thing out of an area. So that came to mind. But you have two Chinooks as well, so that's additional help, I guess. And then on going on further questions, I guess like how many people are actually on the scene or arrived? And within these Chinooks, you can fit from like 30 people up to 60 people if you really push it. So that means potentially 100 plus people could have been on this scene, or maybe it was a lot less. So I have no idea about that. And then also, he would have been able to see the interior of the Chinook as well. So I wonder if there's anything of interest within there. He also got to see within their facility, supposedly. And while these details of everything inside these sort of structures have not been as explored as the actual encounter, I think they're very much worth investigating still because you get to see within the potential operations within the people involved. He does briefly touch on it in some of the interviews, but maybe we'll find out more. But going back to the interior of the Chinook, well, first up, we do know that there was a weird skull mask guy. That was really weird, and I don't know what to make of that. He almost looked demonic in appearance once again. But that just kind of makes me think about like what is the mindset behind these people for sure is what I thought about. And then all the hazmat personnel wearing different hazmats, I guess they all maybe a reason they have that is just like different contingency plans in terms of different hazards that they could be dealing with. Um, and then how did they know that they were down there? Like, how long were they being surveillance for? Weygandt speculates that they could have been surveillancing them for quite a while. Um, and on the climb back up, where were his other teammates exactly? And as soon as they went back up into the ravine, were they already waiting there, or were like, oh, there's other people here, and they got kind of caught off guard by Weygandt's trio, I guess. In terms of the perspective of the other allies that were up on the hill still, they have a whole other story to tell. Like, they were rounded up first, most likely, and maybe they have additional information that might be helpful. And then sometime after this, a very weird scenario happened where Weygandt's car was hit by a government vehicle, and that vehicle left their license plate. And that's currently under investigation, and maybe potential in sort of additional information will appear about that because last time it was talked about on a interview, um, it was talked about that efforts were being put into place into finding out more information about it. So there was that. But then also a Men in Black scenario happened where at Weygandt's grandmother's house, two people were knocking on the door, and Weygandt wasn't there at the time. And they were described as being bold men. One was in the car, and one was knocking on the door, and they were both wearing sunglasses. They looked like twins. They were very emotionless, and the one that was at the door was repeatedly asking a question and in a very monotone voice, just asking to speak to Weygandt. And that feels that's just so weird. Um, so yeah, essentially the grandmother told them to piss off. And yeah, I would like to know more information about that if that's discussed sometime in the future. But it doesn't sound like a fun scenario to be in at all. And then I just want to have a section where I can just have final notes and questions I have. So I'll just start it off really. And the first question is, why were the NHI seemingly still staying around for potentially hours after the crash? And why weren't they sort of rescued or anything like that? Is there some sort of rule set that they have that you can't interfere with because of some sort of cascading domino effects that could occur within a sort of saving event? Or is it like too late because they've already uh, crashed in the past and we have access to their technology already. But these things were fearful for their own lives as well. So, and they were asking for rescue essentially too. So, I I don't know. And then what's the continued psychic communication about that apparently has happened? And is that like the same sort of feeling, or is it purely dream based? Because you would be traumatized after experience something like this, of course. Um, and then just some other notes is that I did base the NHI's facial features on the proportionality and appearance of Whitley Strieber's Communion book cover, but changed it based on the sort of tweaks talked about by Weygandt. And then a little side note is, how did I get those proportions of that small gray? Well, you have a video to look forward to, which is the Bob Lazar UAP, which will be coming out maybe after this one. We'll see. So subscribe just to stick around for that because I have a lot of similar in-depth analysis that I've done on that case that I want to share. And if Weygandt himself happens to see this video, I'll first up say I apologize for the mess around here, but also thank you very much for coming forward all those years ago. And I'm sure the process that usually goes on when I speak to witnesses and become sort of a bouncing board of hyper-specific questions or provide them depictions, then there is usual times you'll notice additional revelations or realizations about very more specific details. And if that's the case, it's good to jot those down. Also, when you're viewing this craft, I don't know if I got all the viewing angles correctly, but I tried to pay attention to as much detail as I could within the witness testimonies that he did and interviews, and I hope I got as close as I could. If I've messed anything up and Weygandt either talks about it publicly, then I just take it into mind all those sort of corrections that should occur. But I hope I got close and gave it all a good depiction. Okay, let's wrap some stuff up now. I just want to be casual and vulnerably real and honest as I speak about this. So expect me to be weirdly transparent and upfront about everything. And I also have an important announcement that I want to make later. My God, this was a huge project to tackle. Um, Research and recreation and this whole sort of project in general took around 600 plus hours, and half of that time was spent in a month, where I basically just, as soon as I woke up, uh, in the AMs, and then I go to sleep in the AMs, and I just do that for a month, doing like, oh God, like, what was it? Maybe 80-hour work weeks or something. And it wasn't good, but basically I managed to power through that and create the depiction that I did here.
This section of the video used to be a lot longer, but the core essence of the discussion is that I'm pretty much just struggling to think about ways that I'm even comfortable with in terms of how can I stay afloat while researching and recreating these things, because in honesty they are a lot of work, but I think they deserve a lot of time and effort into looking into them. But I need to figure out the logistics behind that and ways that I'm even cool with going around that, because there are countless ways that make me feel uncomfortable.
So here's my current best idea. Basically, in private, I've been turning all of these digital models into physical ones and exploring them in that sort of artistic sculptural sense. But also through that process, I'm thinking about the manufacturing process that they would do and how we can do it. And as well as trying to replicate the sort of look and materiality in terms of feasible products that I can get my hands on in this current production process, but as well as exploring sort of the functional aspects that could be occurring within some of these UAP. And I mean, like, I was just doing that for myself, but I reckon people might be interested in also owning some of these, I guess, research models. So if that's of interest of you, check the description as I'll have my link to, I guess, a shop I just set up.
Same thing's occurring here. I just sped it up again because I'm still just struggling in terms of figuring out methods to go around and ways that I feel uncomfortable with going around them. But I feel like an art shop is very isolated and independent of my concerns, at the very least.
And in terms of the digital models, a good chunk of them are viewable in the interactive model viewer in the description. So you can look at all the materiality, the form, and you can even view these things in VR if you want to. A lot of these are a bit difficult to set up, so some of them are still pending. But basically, it's a simulation viewer of all these various UAP. And then if you want access to the digital files themselves for any of these UAP in general, if you're like a researcher or another artist that wants to use them for creative reasons or more investigative processes or whatever, feel free to contact me via email and then we can discuss the specifics. Sorry if this was a bit ranty, but I just wanted to be very thorough and transparent with my current process into looking into how to go about this. But now I also, on top of this, have physical models that you can own. And yeah, this thing, I was messing around with it. It can like glow in the dark and you can blast it with a light, or even better, you can blast it with a UV light and it can like mimic the materiality, which I thought was kind of cool. You can throw like a rainbow LED light into the center of this thing as well, and then that can sort of change into those colors. And it's hard to find things that like let you switch between the the green and purple sort of coloration. But in terms of an actual light inside of this thing, I'm not going to be putting it in a production sense because it's a bit too complicated and prototypey as of currently.
But basically, just know behind the scenes, there's a lot of experimentation going on with different sort of functionality or mechanisms or other things that I could be incorporating into the designs of further upgraded versions of these models. And whether some of those are even feasible within a production sense, I don't really know. And that's what the experimentation's for.
Making this physical model was a fun process, though, of just rapid prototyping and solving out technical issues and finding the right things to use and stuff like that. And thanks for watching. And this was a giant video that I definitely learned a lot through the production and research pipeline of this whole process. And I gotta say that these videos are very much not so much in the form of a conventionally digestible video or corporatized and ready to go, but they're more just like a reflection of my current process into looking into and investigating anomalous phenomena to see which ones may hold more weight than meets the eye. So I'm happy if you made it through all of that. But I want to make a little additional announcement that I briefly touched on before. But I have a Discord now, so if you just want to have a chat, or if you have an experience you want to share, or if you want to assist me with my research, because if you believe I'm making sort of strides or efforts through this, I believe you can too. Because I'm just one person, and I believe if we just instead of clashing heads together, like I see a lot of the community does, if we just combine heads together and just approached it from a very calm and unbiased sort of vetting process of sifting through everything, we would make crazy leg room. So feel free to jump in. And the rest of this video, it's just pretty much for myself, to be honest. But you feel free to stick around. It's just sort of a jam session recap of pretty much all the efforts and art that I made into making a depiction and research around this specific encounter. I've got a lot of things in the works for future projects, and I hope you guys look forward to them because I am for sure. And I'll see you guys next time.